Like, is it possible to get the classic lines, the classic shape, the gist of what the classic bodybuilder looks like naturally without steroids? Hey guys, welcome back. So today I want to talk about basically the elephant in the room whenever it comes to talking about bodybuilding, fitness, and that elephant in the room is steroids. It's probably why the public doesn't like bodybuilding as much as they like other sports. I could go through a lot of reasons why bodybuilding finds itself as kind of this subculture, this kind of fringe culture, but probably the number one reason has to do with the freakiness and the steroids. We usually talk on this channel about classic bodybuilding, which is old school, 60s, 50s, 70s. I like to say maybe mid 50s through late 70s. Maybe even some of the early 80s like Lee Labrada. Now these physiques definitely were enhanced with steroids. In order to be competitive at that time, people were using testosterone-based compounds, and towards the mid 80s, growth hormone and insulin. Prior to that, we see a lot of physiques, especially in the 40s and 50s, that have the classic lines, but aren't quite as big, aren't quite as dense, aren't quite as exaggerated as the guys from the 70s. So look at a guy like Graham Eck. He has extremely good lines. They call him the monarch of muscledom. He has the big arms, the big chest, the tiny waist, and he hits these poses in a way that just creates these iconic, epic images, and we still see them being posted today on like Instagram, old school bodybuilding pages and such. So he wasn't by any means a mass monster. He wasn't even as big as somebody like Frank Zane probably in terms of sheer muscle mass. But what he did have is he had the lines, he had the silhouette, and that's kind of what I want to talk about today. Like, is it possible to get the classic lines, the classic shape, the gist of what the classic bodybuilder looks like naturally without steroids? So there is a lot of debate over when people most likely started using steroids. A number that I've heard that was put out there by Eric Helms. He's a PhD researcher who looks into bodybuilding and exercise physiology and such. He said likely nobody was using before the year of 1953, just because although testosterone in its oral form was available before that, shortly before that, it wasn't widely available to athletes, nor did people really see it as being applicable to bodybuilding before around 1953. So that's kind of the year I keep in my mind of when people probably started using steroids. So because myself and so many people don't wish to use steroids, just for a slew of reasons, how do we reconcile our desire to stay clean with our desire to develop classic lines, to look like an old school bodybuilder, to look like these big mustached, muscled guys from the 70s who just look like Greek gods? You know, everybody wants to look like that. The answer I've come up with is this: we can't look exactly like they do. We can't have the degree of muscularity they do. We can't have the density that they do. If you look at a guy like Mike Mentzer, his muscles are so dense. You can look at them, they look like his pectorals, maybe from front to back, are just, inches thick. You can't be that dense without anabolics. But what you can do is you can get the lines, like I was saying, the classic lines. So when we talk about the classic lines, I kind of touched on this earlier. What we're really talking about is this sort of brawny look that the guys had in the 60s, 70s, like I said, back in the day. Most of the guys who are really successful, you look at Franco, you look at Arnold, Ed Corney, I mean, everybody kind of had their own look back in the old school days, but the guys that have the classic lines, I would say, that really appeal to me, the most important thing seems to be very large arms, very well-developed full arms, a very well-developed full chest, medium-sized shoulders, not capped delts. You'll notice that if you look back at guys from the 60s and 70s, they didn't have these capped delts that almost like go out past the rest of their arm. They had like medium-sized delts. Look at Danny Padilla, for example. You won't see any pictures of him with these freaky alien deltoids that you see on guys now in the IFBB. Their focus was more on having these brawny, muscular arms. So big arms, big chest, medium-sized deltoids, and like medium-sized legs. None of them, except for Tom Platz maybe, had massive quads that created this sort of X-taper shape. The X-taper is kind of a shape of modern bodybuilding. It used to be the V-taper. So the legs are medium-sized. The waist, you can't really control that. That's your genetics, how big your hip bones are, but a smaller waist. So when you combine those features together, you get classic lines, as I call them, and I think most would agree. Now, the other thing you can do to look like these classic bodybuilders, to emulate their shape and how they presented themselves, is to pose like them. So a lot of classic bodybuilders did open-handed poses. If you look at Zayn, if you look at Lee Labrada, these open-handed, Muhammad Makawi, you do these open-handed poses, they really signal grace and flow and kind of this epic look. Like with Zayn when he would do things like this. So that's one way you can do it. The closed-handed, remember, that signals more brawn and strength. You'll never see Arnold doing an open-handed shot, or maybe almost never you'll see him doing that. He would always do closed-handed because it's a very strong look. The other big thing that classic bodybuilders did to pose, to look classic, to accentuate their lines, is to do a lot of twisting. So what they would do is they would tilt their hips to one side, almost like away from the audience, and then tilt the rest of their body towards the audience to make their waist look smaller, to create that illusion. They also would often pose with one leg slightly in front of the other, or one leg out and one leg kind of bearing most of the weight, instead of this kind of like boxed posing that you see nowadays where people have the legs are just shoulder width apart. No, they had one leg out, one leg over here. It was a very graceful kind of pose. And again, it accentuates the lines of the body. The more you can kind of create those lines, the more you'll exaggerate a bigger upper body compared to a small waist. And I've seen it done so many times. I know that it's more than possible to hit these classic poses and pull them off naturally. I'll just play a couple of shots that I've done personally that I think I pull off pretty well. I've been lifting for about 3 years, and I've been practicing posing for maybe about 1 year. But if you combine these elements together and have a good amount of conditioning, you can pretty much pull off the lines of these poses and look quite bigger than you really are when you're posing. I would say the last thing about the golden era guys that separates them from today, when we're talking about how we want to look like them naturally, is body fat levels. So if you look at the guys from, let's say, the 70s, look at Arnold in Pumping Iron. That wasn't his best year, 1975, but he was reasonably conditioned, but he wasn't bone dry conditioned. He wasn't incredibly veiny, incredibly fibrous in terms of, and striated in terms of what you could see underneath the skin. It was kind of this semi-conditioned look, maybe about like 6-7% body fat. This is where the golden era guys would compete at. They wouldn't be bone dry until maybe like the 80s with Zayn and folks like that. I think this added a lot to their physiques. It made them look more healthy. It made them look more strong, more full. So I think what we can do as naturals is we can find this place of body fat that allows us to still stay full and healthy looking and not looking incredibly bone dry. Again, if you're competing in natural bodybuilding, you're gonna have to be absolutely shredded, and you're not gonna really resemble the guys from days past. But in everyday life at the beach, if you're hanging out around this like 7 to 9% body fat, I think that's really the sweet spot for looking like a classic bodybuilder, for not looking too bone dry shredded, but also having a little bit of fullness to the muscles, having a little fullness to the face, just looking more healthy to the everyday person who sees you. So just to recap, you won't be able to look exactly like the guys from the golden era, although I have seen some professional natural bodybuilders who come very, very close. But for most of us, you won't be able to look exactly like them. You won't be able to be quite as dense as they are. You won't be able to have the degree of muscularity that they did. But you can develop the lines. You can develop the idea of what they look like, the gist, the silhouette, through your posing, through your training being emphasized on certain body parts more than others, and through how you condition the body. So you can get pretty close, so don't give up. And remember, to the everyday person, if you lift a little and you put in the effort that we put in as natural bodybuilders, people will think you're big anyways. It's really only the bodybuilding crowd on Instagram and on Reddit or wherever that these little niche differences come into play. So just keep at it. Don't give up because you can't look exactly like Franco Columbu or Arnold. You're developing your own physique. You're developing your own trademarked look. And just go after making that as good as you can make it instead of trying to be like somebody else.